The sun hung low in the sky as Amara boarded the plane, her heart a mix of excitement and fatigue. After a successful business trip to Chicago, she was finally headed home. The flight was packed, but she managed to find her seat near the middle of the cabin. She was used to traveling alone, having done so many times before, but today felt different. The weight of the last few days still hung heavy on her, but she pushed those thoughts aside, hoping that the flight would give her a moment of peace. Amara was in her late 20s, poised and determined, yet soft-spoken. She was a woman who knew how to navigate the world with grace, despite the challenges she faced as a black woman in a predominantly white corporate environment. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around, noticing the mix of passengers. There was a family of 3 across the aisle, a businessman tapping away on his laptop, and a young couple in the row behind her, whispering excitedly. The flight attendants, 2 women and 1 man, were going through their usual routine, walking down the aisles, making sure everyone was buckled in and preparing for takeoff. The plane began to taxi, and Amara gazed out of the window, watching the ground disappear beneath them as the plane lifted into the air. The engines hummed steadily, and for a moment, everything felt calm. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic sound of the plane soothe her thoughts. She was so close to home. So close to finally being able to relax. But as the plane climbed higher, the calm was shattered. It started with a murmur from the back of the plane. A couple of raised voices, followed by a sudden silence that swept through the cabin. Amara opened her eyes, her senses alert. The flight attendants were moving towards the rear of the plane, their expressions tight, trying to assess the situation. The murmurs grew louder, and soon, Amara could hear snippets of an argument. A woman's voice rose above the others, sharp and filled with disdain. "This is unbelievable. Why am I stuck next to this woman? It's ridiculous." Amara's heart skipped a beat. The words were clear, the venom unmistakable. She had heard racist comments before, but it was always a jarring experience. She looked around, seeing that most of the passengers were trying to ignore the situation, pretending nothing was happening. She wasn't sure whether they were uncomfortable or simply didn't care, but in the silence that followed, Amara could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. The flight attendants were still trying to calm the situation, but it was clear that the woman in question wasn't backing down. "I'm asking for a different seat. I'm not sitting here next to her," the woman continued, her voice filled with disgust. Amara's palms began to sweat. She couldn't believe what was happening. She had heard the horror stories, read the news, but never had she thought she'd experience something like this firsthand. It was like a bad dream. The woman's words felt like daggers, sharp and unrelenting. As the argument continued, Amara felt her body tense up. Her instinct was to shrink into herself, to ignore it, to hope it would pass. But she knew deep down that staying silent wouldn't be enough this time. The woman's words weren't just a personal attack, they were an attack on her very identity. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep calm, to navigate uncomfortable situations with grace, but today felt different. Her hands gripped the armrests as her mind raced. A flight attendant walked past her, but Amara didn't have the courage to speak up just yet. She needed time to process. Was it worth confronting? Would it make things worse? Would anyone even support her if she said something? The questions ran through her mind, but the woman's voice kept echoing in her head. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said, standing beside the woman who had been causing the disruption. "We need you to calm down. This is a public space, and we do not tolerate this kind of behavior." But the woman was far from calm. Her face flushed with anger, she leaned in close to the flight attendant. "I'm not going to sit next to someone like her. I'm asking for a new seat," she demanded, her words dripping with contempt. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. The flight attendant, who had been trained to handle difficult passengers, was hesitating. He looked at the woman, then glanced around the cabin, his eyes briefly meeting Amara's before quickly looking away. It was clear, he didn't know how to handle this. The situation was escalating, and the tension in the air grew thick. Other passengers were now beginning to notice, and the atmosphere on the plane shifted from uncomfortable to downright hostile. For a few moments, everything seemed to slow down. Amara's thoughts raced. She had been in situations before where silence felt like the safest choice, where backing down seemed like the easiest route. But this was different. This wasn't just about her, it was about standing up for herself, for every person who had been on the receiving end of hate and discrimination. She couldn't let this moment pass without speaking up. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a deep breath. Her mind flashed to memories of her childhood, when her parents had taught her to always stand tall in the face of adversity, to never let anyone diminish her worth. They had told her that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that she had a responsibility to be brave when the world around her was not. Amara stood up from her seat, her legs shaky but her resolve steady. She turned to face the woman who had been making the derogatory remarks. "Excuse me," Amara's voice cut through the tension in the air, though it trembled slightly. "I'll have you know that I'm just as deserving of respect as anyone else on this plane. I'm not the one who should be moved." The entire cabin seemed to freeze. The woman's eyes widened, clearly surprised that anyone had the audacity to challenge her. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if the entire plane was waiting for someone to make the next move. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby, blinked in surprise, unsure of what to do next. Amara's heart pounded, but she stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "Ma'am, this is not appropriate," the flight attendant finally spoke, his voice steady but unsure. "Please return to your seat, and we'll address this matter once we land." But the woman was undeterred. "I'm not sitting next to her," she shouted, her voice rising. "I don't care if I'm asked to leave the plane. I won't stay here." The situation had reached a boiling point. Amara's stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear, but she knew she couldn't back down now. She had to hold her ground. There was no turning back. Just as things seemed like they were about to spiral out of control, another voice spoke up from the back of the plane. A man, his voice low but firm, said, "This is ridiculous. We're all here to get to our destination safely. You need to calm down and stop making a scene." Amara looked back, seeing the older man standing up from his seat, his expression one of frustration. His words seemed to hit a nerve with the woman, who fell silent for a moment. But it wasn't enough to quell the tension. The flight attendant, still unsure of what to do, motioned for Amara to sit down. "Let's handle this professionally. Please, take your seat, and we'll speak privately about this when we land." Amara hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't let this pass. She had already spoken up, and now she needed to let the moment unfold. Reluctantly, Amara sat back down, her heart still racing. The woman remained silent for the rest of the flight, though the tension in the cabin never fully dissipated. As the plane continued its journey, Amara's thoughts swirled. Had she done the right thing? Should she have confronted the woman more aggressively, or had she made the correct choice by speaking up but backing down? The flight was far from over, and the situation was far from resolved. She knew one thing for sure: the minutes dragged on as the plane cruised through the sky, but for Amara, time seemed to stand still. She couldn't shake the intensity of the moment that had just unfolded. Her heart still raced, and her hands remained clammy as she clutched the armrests. The argument, the woman's words, and the flight attendant's hesitance kept playing over and over in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the venom in the woman's voice and feel the weight of the silence that followed her own confrontation. She had spoken up, but now a new wave of doubt crept in. Was she strong enough to face what might come next? Despite the tense atmosphere in the cabin, the rest of the flight seemed to return to a fragile calm. The woman who had been causing the scene sat in her seat with her arms crossed, her face red with anger, but she no longer made any noise. Amara couldn't help but notice that no one was looking directly at her anymore, as if the entire plane had turned a blind eye. The couple behind her had gone silent, their whispered conversations from earlier replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. The businessman was back to typing on his laptop, his fingers tapping away at the keys, perhaps pretending that nothing had happened. Even the flight attendants seemed to go about their duties more cautiously, no longer offering the easy smiles that had initially filled the cabin. It wasn't until the sound of the plane's intercom crackled that the silence was broken. The captain's voice came over the speakers, announcing that the plane would soon be descending into their destination. Amara glanced out the window, her eyes focused on the city below, but her thoughts remained clouded. She had just been a part of something bigger than herself, something that would be remembered by the people on this plane long after they had disembarked. She had made a decision, a choice to stand up for herself in the face of something that had, for far too long, been left unchallenged. But was it enough? Would the impact of her actions be as profound as she hoped? As the plane began its descent, Amara's mind raced. She thought about the flight attendant who had hesitated, the woman who had hurled the insults, and even the other passengers who had witnessed everything. She felt a strange mix of pride and unease, as if she had done something monumental but wasn't sure what the long-term effects would be. In a way, it felt like the beginning of something bigger, a spark that had been ignited, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. T would change everything. Once the plane had landed and the seatbelt sign was turned off, passengers began to stand and gather their belongings. Amara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that she had to face whatever came with her head held high. She grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment and stood up, ready to exit the plane. But as she moved down the aisle, she noticed that the woman who had caused the disruption had gotten up too. The woman's expression had changed, there was no longer the fiery anger, but something colder. She glanced at Amara briefly, her eyes narrowed, and then quickly looked away. For a moment, Amara felt a sense of victory, as if the confrontation had somehow been won, but the woman's silent anger left an unsettling feeling in her stomach. As Amara stepped into the jet bridge, she could hear the shuffle of footsteps behind her. Turning slightly, she saw one of the flight attendants walking up to her. It was the same woman who had been trying to mediate the situation during the flight. Her face was serious, but there was something else in her eyes, perhaps relief or respect. She stopped in front of Amara, blocking her path slightly, but her tone was calm, measured. "Miss," she began, her voice low but urgent. "I just want to say thank you for speaking up." Amara blinked, surprised by the sudden acknowledgement. She hadn't expected anything from the flight attendants, especially after the way the situation had unfolded. "I didn't want things to escalate," the flight attendant continued. "But I was struggling to handle it on my own, and you stepped in when I couldn't. I appreciate that." Amara felt a rush of mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to brush it off, to say it wasn't a big deal, but another part of her realized how important this moment was. This wasn't just about standing up to a racist passenger, it was about making her voice heard when so many others would stay silent. The flight attendant's words were more than just gratitude, they were a recognition of Amara's courage, even when she felt unsure of her actions. "Thank you," Amara replied softly, her voice carrying more weight than she intended. "I wasn't sure if I did the right thing." The flight attendant nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You did. And trust me, it's not easy to speak up in a situation like that. People will remember this moment." Amara wasn't sure if she agreed. The flight attendant's words felt like a burden in some ways, as if she had set the stage for something even bigger to come. It was one thing to speak up in the moment, but what about the aftermath? What about the ripple effects of her decision, and how it would shape the rest of her life? She felt as if she had just crossed a line, one that she couldn't uncross. As the crowd moved through the airport terminal, Amara's thoughts were a whirlwind. She kept replaying the confrontation in her head, thinking about the woman's angry face, the way the flight attendant had hesitated, and the overall silence that had followed. She had stood her ground, but was that enough? Had the woman learned anything from the exchange? Had the other passengers been moved, or would they forget about it the moment they stepped off the plane? When Amara finally reached the baggage claim area, she spotted a familiar face, her friend, Tasha, waiting for her. Tasha had always been a source of support for her, someone she could talk to about the things that weighed heavily on her heart. As Amara walked up to her, Tasha raised an eyebrow, noticing the change in her friend's demeanor. "You okay?" Tasha asked, her voice soft but concerned. Amara smiled weakly, trying to shrug off the tension that still lingered. "Yeah. It's just been a strange day." Tasha nodded, sensing that there was more to the story. "What happened?" And as Amara began to tell Tasha everything, from the argument with the woman to the flight attendant's unexpected words of praise, she realized that this moment, this decision, had already begun to shape her in ways she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a story of standing up to racism on a plane, it was the beginning of a journey. A journey of growth, of learning what it truly meant to be brave, to be vocal, and to make a difference in the world, even when it felt like no one was listening. It was a reminder that one act of courage, no matter how small it seemed, could change everything. As they walked out of the airport together, Amara felt a sense of clarity she hadn't expected. The day had started like any other, but now it was clear, her life had just shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer the same person who had boarded that plane hours ago. The woman's words, the flight attendant's gratitude, and the weight of the decision she had made, it all swirled together, leaving Amara with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, she was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the flight felt like an emotional whirlwind for Amara. She couldn't shake the memory of the confrontation, replaying every moment in her mind. Her thoughts constantly swirled around the choice she had made, the tension in the cabin, and the lingering silence that followed her bold act of courage. She hadn't realized how much the incident had affected her until she found herself constantly checking social media, looking for any sign of the ripple effect her actions might have caused. She didn't expect anyone to recognize her or to make a big deal out of it, but a small part of her wondered if the story of what had happened on that plane had made its way beyond the confines of the flight itself. One evening, just a few days after the incident, Amara was sitting in her apartment, scrolling through the endless news feed on her phone. As she tapped her screen aimlessly, a notification popped up, an article that immediately caught her eye. It was from a local news outlet, and the headline read, "Woman's bold stand against racism on flight sparks heated debate." Her heart skipped a beat, and she clicked on the link immediately. The article detailed the events that had occurred on the flight, the argument between Amara and the racist passenger, the flight attendant's involvement, and how the entire situation had escalated. But there was something in the tone of the piece that startled Amara. The author of the article had taken a strong stance, praising her actions, but the comments section was flooded with mixed opinions. Some people hailed her as a hero, applauding her courage in standing up against prejudice, while others criticized her for making a scene. The words "hero" and "troublemaker" were used in the same breath. Some argued that she should have just let the situation go, that by confronting the woman, she had made things worse for herself. Others were more sympathetic, acknowledging that racism should never go unchecked. Amara stared at the screen for a long time, the flood of emotions overwhelming her. She had hoped for a positive reaction, but the backlash was louder than she had anticipated. Some of the comments even questioned her character, making assumptions about her based on her race and her actions. She didn't know how to feel. There was a part of her that was proud of her decision, but the harsh judgment from strangers stung deeply. Was it worth it? Was the attention she had inadvertently garnered something she had truly wanted, or had she opened a door to a world of unwanted scrutiny? That night, Amara couldn't sleep. Her mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder if she had done the right thing. The weight of the public's judgment felt heavy on her shoulders, and she found herself questioning her own motives. Had she made a difference, or had she just stirred the pot for the sake of a dramatic moment? She wasn't sure anymore. The emotional high she had felt right after the flight was fading, replaced by self-doubt. The next morning, Amara decided to visit her favorite coffee shop to clear her head. She ordered her usual, an iced caramel macchiato, and found a quiet corner by the window. As she sat there, sipping her drink, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from Tasha. "Hey, saw the article. You okay? People are crazy. Don't let them get to you." Amara smiled weakly, grateful for her friend's support. Tasha had always been there for her, even when things felt impossible. It had been Tasha who had encouraged her to confront the woman on the plane in the first place, reminding her that silence only perpetuated the problem. Tasha had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. Amara typed a quick response. "I'm fine. Just, not sure what to think anymore." Seconds later, her phone buzzed again. Tasha had sent a voice message this time. "Listen to me, Amara. You did the right thing. People are always going to criticize you, especially when you step outside the norm. You stood up for what's right, and that takes guts. Don't let the noise drown out your courage. You're making a difference, even if it's hard to see right now." Amara listened to the message, closing her eyes for a moment as Tasha's words sank in. She had a point. There would always be people who would disagree, always those who would criticize from the safety of their screens. But the truth was, Amara wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. She had made a stand, and maybe it was the beginning of something bigger. Maybe it wasn't just about this one moment on a plane, it was about something more. As she sat there, her mind slowly began to clear. Amara realized that her actions had indeed sparked something bigger than herself. She wasn't just some random person confronting a racist passenger, she was a symbol of resistance against injustice, whether she liked it or not. The attention was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. It was a reminder that the world wasn't going to change unless people took a stand. And even if she didn't have all the answers, she knew she had made the right choice. A few weeks passed, and the incident began to fade from the public eye, but the impact lingered. Amara continued to live her life as best as she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had started something that had the potential to change her, and maybe even the world, in ways she couldn't predict. She received messages from people she didn't know, many of them thanking her for her bravery, for showing them that it was okay to speak out against injustice. Others shared their own stories of discrimination, telling her that her actions had inspired them to confront the injustices they had faced in their own lives. But there were also those who continued to criticize her. Some suggested that she had only escalated the situation, making the flight uncomfortable for everyone. But with every message, every comment, Amara began to understand that this wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about standing up for what was right, regardless of the outcome. She had made a difference, even if it wasn't always visible in the way she had imagined. Amara's reflection on the incident was also a reflection of society, a society that often preferred silence over confrontation, that allowed prejudice and injustice to continue because it was easier than facing the uncomfortable truth. But by making the choice to speak out, Amara had become part of the solution. She had opened a door for conversations to be had, for people to realize that silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable. And though the journey wasn't easy, Amara knew one thing: she had made the world a little bit better by simply choosing to stand up. The future might not have been certain, but the lessons learned from that one flight would stay with her for a lifetime. The days that followed were a mix of quiet reflection and sudden bursts of recognition. Amara couldn't escape the feeling that her life had irrevocably changed. The world outside her apartment seemed quieter, somehow, as though everyone around her was going about their lives, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through hers. But on the inside, it was different. The questions didn't stop. The comments on her social media posts didn't stop. Some praised her bravery, others called her reckless, and a few even threatened her. She had stepped into a larger conversation, one she wasn't sure she was ready for, but now there was no turning back. On the surface, it seemed like everything was going back to normal. She returned to work, smiled politely when she interacted with customers, and tried to live her life as she always had. But beneath that, there was a tension in her chest, a restlessness that would not go away. Amara had done something big, and now she had to wrestle with its consequences. She couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened, couldn't ignore the weight of the words, the judgments, and the expectations. One evening, while waiting for the subway, she saw a group of people gathered near the platform. They were huddled around a phone, laughing and chatting. She heard snippets of their conversation as they passed by her, the familiar cadence of gossip and chatter. And then, one of the voices broke through, catching her attention. "Yeah, did you see that woman on the flight? The one who confronted that racist passenger? What was she thinking? She really made a scene, huh?" Amara froze. The words hit her like a physical blow. She turned her head slightly, trying not to make it obvious that she was listening. She had heard these kinds of things before, people's reactions, their opinions. But hearing it in real life, hearing them talk about her like she was some kind of spectacle, made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. It was one thing to read comments online, to see people's faces hidden behind screens. It was another to hear it in the world, to realize how far-reaching the effects of her actions had been. Her stomach tightened. The whole incident had somehow turned into a public spectacle, something that people were talking about like it was just another piece of gossip. But to Amara, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't something she could just brush off. This wasn't about a moment of drama or a viral video. It was about standing up for what was right, for something bigger than herself. And yet, as she stood there, waiting for the train, she couldn't help but feel small, insignificant, like her actions had been reduced to just another story for people to talk about. When she got home that night, Amara sat down on her bed, her phone still in her hand. The notifications from social media had piled up again. She had received a message from a woman named Kelly, who wrote that she had been inspired by Amara's actions and wanted to thank her. Kelly had faced racism in her own life and said she never knew how to respond, how to fight back. But seeing Amara stand up on the flight had given her the courage to speak up when she encountered racism in her own community. It was a message of thanks, and it meant more than anything. But there were also others who had reached out, angry or confused by Amara's actions. One message in particular stood out: "You could have just ignored her, let it go. You made it worse for everyone." This person didn't know what Amara had been through, didn't understand what it was like to endure that kind of treatment. But they didn't have to. The truth was, some people would never understand the struggle, never comprehend the decision it took to speak up, especially when the world often tells you to be silent. For Amara, it was a constant battle between doing what was right and facing the consequences, but she couldn't stop herself from thinking about the impact her decision had already had on others. The following days were a blur. Amara's life had been divided into two worlds, before the flight and after. There was no going back. And yet, as the weeks passed, she began to notice something subtle but powerful. In the places she frequented, she was seeing small shifts, moments that proved her actions hadn't been in vain. On one of her morning commutes, she overheard two strangers discussing a similar incident they had witnessed at a local cafe, and one of them said, "If more people spoke up, maybe we'd see real change." Amara hadn't realized it at the time, but her decision had become a conversation starter, a spark that ignited other people's courage. People were talking more openly about racism, calling it out when they saw it. And it wasn't just about the flight, it was about creating a culture where people no longer felt the need to stay silent, to turn away when confronted with injustice. Amara had begun to realize something important. It wasn't about being celebrated or condemned. It wasn't about whether or not everyone agreed with her decision. What mattered was that she had taken action, that she had given others permission to do the same. And in that, she had found something powerful. Still, the journey wasn't easy. There were moments when Amara questioned her own courage. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering if she had done the right thing, if there had been a better way to handle the situation. And then, there were moments when she realized that the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. She would continue to face resistance, continue to confront prejudice, and continue to be judged. But she also realized that each time she stood up, each time she chose to speak out, it would be a victory, no matter how small. One evening, as she sat in a park near her apartment, Amara reflected on the journey she had taken. It was a quiet evening, and she could hear the distant hum of city life in the background. A soft breeze rustled the leaves above her, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the calmness wash over her. The journey had been challenging, full of doubt and fear, but it had also been transformative. She had discovered something about herself, something she hadn't known before. She wasn't just a passenger on that flight, watching as history unfolded. She was part of it. And in that moment, Amara realized that change had already started, and she was part of it. What she had begun on that flight was far from over. She smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The fight for justice wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And Amara knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as long as she could stand firm in her beliefs, as long as she could continue to fight for what was right, she would find the strength to keep going. Because some battles weren't meant to be won in a single moment, they were won in the quiet, persistent courage that refused to be silenced. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effect of Amara's actions continued to reverberate through her life in unexpected ways. The tension she had initially felt slowly began to give way to a sense of purpose she hadn't anticipated. She had been thrust into a pivotal moment, one that forced her to confront not only the harsh realities of the world but also her own role within it. Despite the uncertainty that had followed her decision to act on the flight, there was no denying the transformation it had sparked within her, and in others. It was on a rainy afternoon, sitting at a cafe while waiting for a meeting with a community outreach group, when Amara first understood the full extent of the shift she had initiated. As she sipped her coffee, lost in her thoughts, she overheard a conversation at the table next to hers. Two older women were discussing the very incident she had been part of, and they were both speaking with admiration. "I saw that video," one of them said. "That woman, standing up to the passenger like that. It was powerful. And it made me think. You know, we've been quiet about these things for so long. But maybe we shouldn't be." The other woman nodded. "Exactly. It's hard to speak up sometimes. But that moment, it really got to me. We've got to stand together. All of us." Amara felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure whether they had seen the whole incident or just the viral clips, but hearing strangers talk about it, hearing them acknowledge the need for change, it was surreal. She had no idea that her one decision, made in the heat of the moment, had sparked something so much bigger than herself. It wasn't just her story anymore, it was everyone's story. And she could see now how the collective voices of those who had remained silent for so long were starting to rise up, uniting in a way that gave her hope. After the meeting, which had been focused on organizing a series of community dialogues about race and inclusion, Amara sat in her car, reflecting on everything that had led her here. The public recognition, the online debates, the support from unexpected allies, it had all shaped her in ways she never could have imagined. What had started as a single act of defiance had now become a movement of sorts, one that encouraged people to speak out, to demand more, to refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. But there were still obstacles, of course. Amara had become a symbol, but that meant she was also a target for criticism. The more public her actions became, the more personal the attacks grew. It wasn't uncommon for her to find scathing comments online, ones that accused her of being too sensitive or creating drama where none existed. Some said she had made the situation worse, escalating a simple misunderstanding into a major incident. Others even went so far as to accuse her of wanting attention, of trying to turn a routine flight into an episode of drama for the camera. These comments didn't faze her as much as they used to. She had learned to filter out the noise. But there were still moments, especially in the early hours of the morning, when the doubt would creep in. Was she really doing the right thing? Was it worth all the backlash? These questions seemed to echo in her mind as she navigated her newfound role as a public figure. She had never asked to be in the spotlight. She wasn't someone who had actively sought attention or recognition. But she had found herself at the center of a conversation that was far bigger than her own personal journey. It was about more than just race, it was about power, privilege, and accountability. It was about the courage to challenge societal norms, to demand change when it felt impossible. She realized that, no matter how much criticism she faced, she couldn't back down now. She had sparked something, and she wasn't going to let it fizzle out. Her involvement in the community outreach group deepened, and she found herself engaging with people from all walks of life, those who had been directly affected by racism, those who had witnessed it but never spoken up, and those who simply wanted to learn more. Through these conversations, Amara's perspective began to shift. She understood now that the change she was hoping for couldn't come from one person alone. It had to be a collective effort, a movement that transcended individuals. And the only way to make that happen was to keep speaking out, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it felt like nothing was changing. It was during one of these outreach meetings that Amara met Sophie, a woman in her mid-50s who had been following Amara's story since the flight incident. Sophie was a retired teacher, someone who had spent her life teaching history and trying to instill values of fairness and equality in her students. When she first saw the video of Amara standing up to the racist passenger, she was moved, but it was not until they met in person that Sophie truly understood the depth of Amara's actions. "You know," Sophie said, her voice soft but firm, "I spent so many years teaching students about the civil rights movement, about standing up for what's right. But I've never actually done it myself, not like you did. Not in such a direct way. You've made me rethink everything." Amara smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. She had always admired teachers, those who worked tirelessly to shape young minds, and hearing Sophie's words felt like a powerful acknowledgement of the impact her decision had made. "I didn't know how far it would go," Amara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan for any of this. But it's like a domino effect, you know? It's starting conversations, it's encouraging people to stand up for each other. And that's what matters." As the days continued, Amara received more messages from people like Sophie, people who had been silently watching the world around them, unsure of how to contribute to the change they wanted to see. They shared stories of their own experiences, moments when they had remained quiet, when they had failed to speak up. And with each message, Amara realized that the moment on the plane had become more than just a personal victory, it had become a catalyst for others to find their voices. But not everyone saw it that way. There were still many who resisted the change, who refused to believe that what Amara had done was anything more than a one-off act of defiance. To some, it was just another instance of someone stirring the pot. But Amara had learned to tune out that kind of thinking. She knew that real change took time, and it wasn't always going to be easy. But she also knew that the hardest part was over, she had taken the first step. And that was the most important part of all. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but Amara knew that by continuing to stand her ground, by continuing to speak up, she could be a part of the movement that made it happen. Her journey was far from over, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she had no doubt that it would lead to something better. She had found her purpose in a way she never expected, and she was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she wasn't alone in this fight. The courage that had once been a solitary act had now become a collective force, one that would not be easily silenced. Months passed, and Amara's life began to settle into a new rhythm, though it was one vastly different from the life she had known before the flight incident. She had become something of a local hero, a symbol of courage and strength, but also of the deep need for societal change. Despite the recognition and support she had received, there were moments when she found herself overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. The sense of responsibility that had been thrust upon her was both a privilege and a burden. It was no longer just about her story, it was about what her story represented. She had opened a door that many people were now walking through, and that reality weighed heavily on her shoulders. One chilly evening, as Amara walked through her neighborhood, the same streets she had walked countless times before, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after a storm, and she could feel the tension in the air. She passed by the cafe where she had overheard the conversation about the flight incident, now a place that felt strangely familiar. It wasn't just a cafe anymore, it was a symbol of the change that was slowly taking root in her community. But not all change was met with open arms. Amara knew that there were people who still believed that what she had done was unnecessary, that she had overreacted to a situation that didn't warrant such a public spectacle. She had heard the whispers, the comments made in passing, and it stung every time. It wasn't that she cared about the judgment of strangers, but the fact that some people, especially those in her own community, couldn't understand why she had acted the way she did made her question the divide between them. She had taken a stand for what was right, yet there were those who still saw it as nothing more than a disruption to the status quo. Despite these occasional doubts, Amara continued to engage with the community, speaking at local events, participating in town halls, and organizing group discussions aimed at creating more open conversations about race, privilege, and equality. Her words were powerful, but she had learned that sometimes the most profound changes happened in the quiet moments, the one-on-one conversations where real connections were made. It was these intimate interactions that gave her hope, reminding her that the work was being done, one conversation at a time. One day, as she prepared for another public speaking engagement, Amara received a letter from a woman named Maria, who had been a passenger on the flight that fateful day. Maria had reached out to apologize for her own behavior during the incident. In her letter, Maria admitted that she had been uncomfortable with the way the situation had unfolded, but in hindsight, she realized that her discomfort had stemmed from a place of unexamined privilege. She thanked Amara for showing her that it was possible to stand up to injustice without fear, and that sometimes, the discomfort was necessary in order to grow. Reading the letter left Amara speechless. She had never expected an apology, let alone such an introspective and heartfelt one. Maria's words were a reminder that even in the midst of adversity, there were people who were willing to listen, to reflect, and to change. It was moments like these that made all the challenges worth it. But it wasn't just strangers who were impacted by Amara's actions. Her family, too, had undergone a transformation. At first, her mother had been concerned about the attention Amara was receiving, worried that it would lead to trouble. She had always tried to shield her daughter from conflict, but now, she saw something different in her. Her daughter wasn't just reacting to an incident, she was fighting for something greater than herself. Amara's father, too, had softened in his approach, finally acknowledging the significance of her actions. He had always been proud of her, but now, he was in awe of the strength she had found in herself. Amara's relationship with her younger brother, Deshaun, had changed in ways that were both surprising and heartening. Deshaun, who had always admired his sister from afar, found himself opening up to her more than he ever had before. He began to share his own experiences of discrimination, things that had always been left unsaid. It was as if Amara's actions had given him the courage to finally speak out, to confront the injustices that had quietly shaped his own life. The bond between them deepened, and Amara realized that, in some ways, their shared journey had brought them closer than they had ever been. But the most profound change came from within. Amara had always been a person who valued peace and avoided conflict whenever possible. She had prided herself on her ability to navigate the complexities of life without stirring the pot. But now, she understood that peace was not always the answer. There were moments when silence was complicity, when standing by and doing nothing allowed injustice to continue unchecked. She had learned that it was okay to be uncomfortable, that discomfort was often the first step toward change. The weight of responsibility was not always easy to bear, but Amara had come to accept that she could not shy away from it. She had been given an opportunity to make a difference, and she wasn't going to squander it. In a way, the flight incident had been the catalyst for her own personal evolution. What had started as a moment of anger and frustration had transformed into a purpose-driven mission to make the world a better place. And while there was still so much work to be done, Amara knew that she was part of something larger than herself, something that had the potential to change the course of history. As she prepared for another public speaking event, this time at a local high school, Amara stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse. She smiled at her reflection, feeling a sense of peace settle within her. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had chosen. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: the courage she had shown on that flight had set in motion a chain of events that would continue to inspire others for years to come. In the end, that was all she could ask for, the chance to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than she had found it. As she walked onto the stage at the school auditorium, the applause that greeted her felt different now. It wasn't just for the woman who had taken a stand on a plane, it was for the person she had become. And in that moment, Amara realized that she had not only changed her own life, but she had changed the lives of countless others, too. The impact of her decision had rippled through the community in ways she had never imagined. And as she stood before the crowd, she knew that the story was far from over. It was only just beginning.